July 16, 1945. The American Manhattan Project detonates the first atomic bomb in the Mojave Desert. Robert Oppenheimer, the leading scientist behind the project, quoted the Bhagavad Gita by saying,
"Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
He could not have been more correct. August 6th and 9th, 21 days later, bombs were dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of people in an instant. In 1961, the USSR detonates the largest bomb known to man, the Tsar Bomba, marking the peak of the global nuclear arms race. Since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these bombs have not been used in combat, but can we still justify the use of the first ones? This and more will be explored in today's 60 Minutes. Prior to the German surrender, the three Allied leaders, Winston Churchill of Great Britain, Joseph Stalin of the USSR, and President Roosevelt of the USA met in Yalta, on the Crimean Peninsula, to discuss their visions of a post-war Europe. The most profound agreement of this conference was a pledge by Stalin to join the fight against Japan, 3 months after the soon-to-be German surrender on March 9th, Moscow time. 6 months later, after Germany had surrendered to the Allied powers, the leaders of the same three nations met again. However, this time Harry Truman replaced Roosevelt, and Churchill was replaced halfway through by Prime Minister Attlee. This conference marked the beginning of the conflict between the USA and the USSR in terms of their interests in Europe as well as in the Japanese Empire. After Potsdam, the war in Europe was over. The USA and the USSR could act out of natural interest and did no longer have to be allies in order to defeat Germany. Both nations realized this, and realized that they could take any of the land they wanted, as long as their military was in control of it. This would soon be true for the land of the Japanese Empire. When Japan surrendered, the Soviets and the Americans knew whoever had the most land in the area had the most influence over it. During Yalta and Potsdam, Truman and Stalin fell out over the question of Eastern Europe's, especially Poland's, governance, borders, and future. The historian Gar Apolowitz, a leading historian on the decision to use the bomb, claims that, and I quote, "The bombs were dropped primarily to impress Stalin with American power and to force agreement on the main issue of the dispute," which in this context was the future of Poland and Eastern Europe. At this time, the Americans were poised to invade mainland Japan with its victory over the Japanese in Okinawa. And the Soviets had military bases in the port of Vladivostok and armies assembled on their borders between Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Both nations had Japan in their interests, and Truman knew he had the power over Stalin with the atom bomb. And in demonstration of this power by actually using the bomb may give the USA the upper hand in obtaining Japan's land after its surrender, as well as gaining American influence in Eastern Europe and Poland, who were occupied by Soviet forces. During the Potsdam Conference, and on July 26th, the leaders of the USA, the United Kingdom, and the Republic of China drafted the Potsdam Declaration, which was designed to be a final effort to convince the Japanese to surrender. Previous attempts had called for the unconditional surrender of all of Japan, but the Potsdam Declaration only asked for the unconditional surrender of the Japanese armed forces. The terms of the declaration was delivered through radio broadcasts as well as leaflets dropped by Allied planes, bringing the declaration to the attention of all Japanese citizens. This message by President Truman was also globally broadcasted, and summarizes the declaration.
"There can be no peace in the world until the military power of Japan is destroyed, with the same completeness as was the power of the European dictators. To do that, we are now engaged in a process of deploying millions of our armed forces against Japan in a mass movement of troops and supplies and weapons over 14,000 miles, a military and naval feat unequaled in all history. Substantial portions of Japan's key industrial centers have been leveled to the ground in a series of record incendiary raids. What has already happened to Tokyo will happen to every Japanese city whose industries feed the Japanese war machine. If the Japanese insist on continuing resistance beyond the point of reason, their country will suffer the same destruction as Germany. Our blows will destroy their whole modern industrial plant and organization, which they have built up during the past century and which they are now devoting to a hopeless cause. We have no desire or intention to destroy or enslave the Japanese people, but only surrender can prevent the kind of ruin which they have seen come to Germany as a result of continued useless resistance.
Here are some of the most important terms used in the Declaration itself. The prodigious land, sea, and air forces of the United States, the British Empire, and of China, many times reinforced by their armies and air fleets from the West, are poised to strike the final blows upon Japan. This military power is sustained and inspired by the determination of all the Allied nations to prosecute the war against Japan until she ceases to resist. The Japanese military forces, after being completely disarmed, shall be permitted to return to their homes with the opportunity to lead peaceful and productive lives. We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. 2 days after the massive and largely successful broadcast of the Declaration, Japanese Prime Minister Suzuki rejected the Declaration. He stated it was merely a, and I quote, rehash of the previous demands for unconditional surrender, and that the Japanese government did not find any important value in it. This final denial of the surrender made the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki inevitable. The Allies had tried everything in their power to make Japan surrender without further loss of life. Henry L. Stimson, the U.S. Secretary of War during World War II, approved the use of the atomic bomb against Japan. He later wrote, "I felt that to exact a genuine surrender from the Japanese Emperor and his military advisors, there must be administered a tremendous shock which would carry convincing proof of our power to destroy the empire. Such an effective shock would save many times the number of lives, both American and Japanese, than it would cost." The April of 1945 invasion of the island of Okinawa brought American forces to the doorstep of the Japanese home islands. This island of Okinawa saw some of the fiercest fighting of the entire war and claimed over 240,000 lives. The decision to drop the bomb was made because the Americans believed that the number of deaths would have been greater if the U.S. had invaded Japan and taken it city by city. It is estimated that between 129,000 and 246,000 deaths occurred in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs. So the drop of the atomic bombs were a way to save a greater number of people from both parties, as opposed to killing a larger number of people in every city. It was estimated that, according to Henry L. Stimson, over 500,000 American soldiers would have been lost in a full-scale invasion of Japan, more than had been killed in the entire European theater. The invasion of Okinawa was considered to be a test case for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. The invasion of this tiny island required a naval armada larger than the one assembled for the D-Day invasions, but still, the battle claimed over 100,000 American casualties. The Americans wanted to save the lives of their soldiers. The point of view is summed up by a quote from the diary of Paul Fussell, a young American serving in the U.S. Army and prepared to invade the Japanese mainland. "I was a 21-year-old second lieutenant leading a rifle platoon. When the bombs dropped and the news began to circulate that the invasion of Japan would not, after all, take place, that we would not be obliged to run up the beaches near Tokyo, assault firing while being mortared and shelled, we cried with relief and joy. We are going to live. We are going to grow up to adulthood after all." The atomic bomb can be argued to have saved lives. Without it, the American military would have had to follow through with their plan to invade the Japanese home islands. This invasion would not have only cost countless American lives, but also many Japanese. Theodore Van Kirk, the navigator on board the Enola Gay, said in his diary, "I honestly believe the use of the atomic bomb saved lives in the long run. There were a lot of lives saved. Most of the lives saved were Japanese." In the entire history of Allied attempts to force Japan into a surrender, they did so with requesting and leaving no alternative to an unconditional surrender, which means that the victorious party does not need to give any guarantees to the surrendering party. This was always proven unsuccessful with the Japanese. This was made clear when the Japanese government rejected the call to unconditionally surrender based on the Potsdam Declaration, which was as lenient as the Allies could go. This unwillingness towards unconditional surrender can be summed up by an intercepted message from Japan's Foreign Minister Togo to Japan's ambassador in Moscow, Naotaka Sato. It is in His Majesty's heart desire to see the swift termination of war. However, as long as America and England insist on unconditional surrender, our country has no alternative but to see it through in an all-out effort for the sake of survival and honor of the homeland. Prior to the dropping of the atomic bomb, Japan was working on peace negotiations with the Allies through its Moscow ambassador, Naotaka Sato, in July of 1945. Truman knew of these developments, for the USA broke the Japanese message code years earlier, and all of Japan's military and diplomatic messages were being intercepted by the Americans. On July 13, 1945, Japanese Foreign Minister Togo stated, and I quote, "Unconditional surrender is the only obstacle to peace." Truman knew this, but ignored the opportunities to negotiate. The main concern for the Japanese in negotiating around the unconditional surrender was regarding the future of their emperor. The Emperor Hirohito, to the Japanese people, was a god, and they would fight to the death for him. If the Allied leaders agreed that the Japanese emperor could stay on the throne, then they may have surrendered. However, according to an opinion poll done in America in early 1945, 1 in 3 Americans wanted Emperor Hirohito hanged. Because of this, Truman did not feel he could leave the emperor on the throne, and therefore making negotiations between the Allies and Japan fruitless and impossible. After the war against Germany, the USA could concentrate on the Pacific War against Japan. The USA was winning nearly every battle in the Pacific and taking back all Japanese-held islands. The power of the American naval fleets were simply too overpowering for the Japanese to repel. For example, the American naval armada that invaded the small island of Okinawa was far larger than the one assembled to invade France on D-Day. When the USA and their allied forces invaded Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Japanese fought to take the islands back. They resorted to making heavy use of kamikaze and thousands of suicide ships. However, even these very destructive actions could not bring the American fleet in the Pacific to its knees. The War Journal of the Imperial Headquarters of Japan concluded, "We can no longer direct the war with any hopes of success. The only course left is for Japan's 100 million people is to sacrifice their lives by charging the enemy to make them lose the will to fight." Prior to the atomic bombings, the American firebombing campaigns had already destroyed the majority of Japanese industry in the city of Tokyo. This bombing lasted over the course of 48 hours and killed anywhere from 75 to 200,000 people, more than any one of the atomic bombings. The bombing of the cities did not happen only to Tokyo. Nearly every large population or industrial center in Japan was bombed by American bombers, to such an extent that Hiroshima was chosen to receive the atomic bombs only because it was one of the last standing cities in Japan. Most of Japanese industry was also destroyed in these raids. The Allied forces also put in place a massive and very successful sea blockade on the Japanese home islands. Japan, being an island nation, relied heavily on imports of fuel and food. This blockade starved the Japanese people as well as the Japanese war machine. The situation in Japan prior to the bombings is summed up by this quote by Kyoichi Kido, who was an advisor to Emperor Hirohito, describing why he wanted peace prior to the bombings. The cities of Japan were being burned by bombings. At least one city, and at times two, were being turned to ashes daily. Rice crops were extremely bad. Everything became scarce. The food situation was gradually becoming worse and worse. Under such conditions, even the soldiers had not much to eat. With winter ahead, I said I cannot bear the responsibility of tens of millions of people dying a dog's death from hunger and exposure. By the time the atom bombs were dropped, Japan was already on its knees. The Japanese leaders knew that they had already lost the war. It was only a matter of time before they surrendered. On August 15, 1945, General MacArthur gave his victory speech aboard the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
That same day, Emperor Hirohito gave his defeat speech to the people of Japan. The Second World War was officially over. This announcement of surrender came 6 days after the last nuclear strike on Nagasaki. In 1945, the Allies praised the nuclear bomb, for it ended the war and brought their soldiers back home. Today, as we live under the nuclear threat, some say it is justified, while others think it was not. This separation of thought will continue for decades to come. However, the bomb did end the largest and bloodiest war in history as quick as possible. It may have killed many innocent people, but it saved many more from the American invasion of Japan. It may seem immoral today, but back in 1945, a war was raging, and we cannot forget what war does.
It worked as designed, but it has done what war does. It destroys people.